the Russians are being exhorted to go forward, and if they withdraw, they'll be shot by their commanders. We were played radio intercepts where it appeared to be the Russians telling their troops they had to go forward. If they came back, they would be shot.
Hello, welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and this time we are joined by Maxim Tucker. Maxim is the Times' Ukraine correspondent. He's been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. Maxim, good to see you again. And you are just back from Ukraine, aren't you, where you were with soldiers of a Ukrainian tank company on the front line near Kostyantynivka in Donetsk. What's the situation there, and how close are the Russians?
So this Kostyantynivka is a really important rail and road junction, which would give Putin a really useful amount of control over that area of the Donbass region. And he's been desperate to take. He's been pushing from one direction through Chasiv Yar, and now he's pushing up from Toretsk, which the Russian forces have all but occupied. And this Ukrainian tank brigade has been trying to hold the Russians back and has been inflicting incredibly heavy losses on the Russians. They told me their brigade alone had inflicted around 3,000 Russian kills that they'd confirmed by video in that sector of the front. And there's other brigades fighting alongside them. So it's a really terrifically heavy losses that the Russians are taking in that area, but they continue to push forwards. And what they're trying to do is small groups of Russian soldiers try and infiltrate Ukrainian positions. Ukrainians don't have enough men to hold large swathes of territory. It's difficult for them to hold the line. So the Russians infiltrate one or two soldiers. They get to a kind of stronger position, like a house or something behind Ukrainian lines, and then they gather in a kind of platoon size and try and assault Ukrainian positions from behind at that point. The Ukrainians are normally spotting them with drones and picking them off as they do it, but every now and again they succeed. And they told me about this one instance where a platoon had managed to gather in an industrial building on the outskirts of Toretsk.
And Maxim, you say they've all but taken Toretsk. I mean, how much of Toretsk has been occupied by Russians now?
So it's a back and forth battle, but the Russians are at the northernmost tip of the town, and they're fighting with the Ukrainians over an industrial zone. The Ukrainians are trying to make counterattacks to push the Russians back from that. But really, the line seems to be held. The top of the town is held by the Russians, and then there's a series of fields and then some villages, one called Dachna, where the Ukrainians are holding the lines there. And stopping the Russians from advancing any further for now. It's very difficult to advance in today's modern warfare, with drones in the air. It's very difficult to advance across wide open spaces.
And this is a fight that's been going on for, 7 or 8 months, is that right, in the Toretsk area? How intense has the fighting been?
It's incredibly intense. It's been, very close quarters urban combat for a lot of this. Ukrainian infantry in one building firing at Russian infantry in another building. The Ukrainians say it's easier for the Russians to fight through urban terrain, actually, because they're able to take cover from the drones in these houses, and it makes it more difficult for the Ukrainians to deploy the kind of FPV tactics that they've been using very successfully in this war. And the Russians simply use their weight in numbers to keep pushing and overwhelm the Ukrainians, but they're doing it at terrific cost. They're taking thousands and thousands of casualties. The Ukrainians estimate that the Russians have lost 13,500 missing in action over the course of the Battle of Toretsk. Now, almost all of those are probably killed, but the nature of the battlefield now is that it's very difficult to retrieve your wounded, very difficult to retrieve your dead, because any vehicle that goes out into the open to try and take people back from their positions is immediately targeted by FPV drones. And you have to think really carefully about whether you're going to risk lives to send people to collect dead bodies.
And that high price that Russia has paid for every inch of land it's taken. I mean, the Ukrainian forces have really defied expectations, haven't they? How have they managed to make them pay so highly for this?
So a lot of it is using really modern technology to great advantage. They pioneered the use of drones and FPV drones, these suicide drones, which can pinpoint Russian individual soldiers and hit them as they advance forward. They've got thermal imaging cameras. They're using AI technology to track Russian movements and to help with targeting. This race of technology is on both sides now. The Russians also have drones. They're starting to use fiber optic drones, which are connected by a hardwire cable to attack Ukrainian positions. But the Ukrainians are also using those fiber optic drones now, and they're increasingly, both sides are also using wireless drones, but they have AI targeting, so that the pilot will direct the drone very close to the Russian positions, and then even if it loses signal with the controller, the drone knows what kind of targets it's supposed to look for in the final kilometer, 500 meters. And the periods that the AI is able to take over control is becoming longer and longer. Actually, the distances are increasing.
Mhm. And you got some footage while you were out there, and it illustrates your latest dispatch, Maxim. Let's talk through it now.
So this is still quite unusual that we see a tank advancing. They only use tanks when it's quite overcast weather like this. You can see it's quite misty, it's quite foggy. The Russians had been advancing, and they in small groups, and they managed to congregate in this industrial building here. And you can see one of them firing his weapon. The Ukrainians, and he's just across the road in another building. Because the Russians had managed to congregate, because it was overcast weather and the Ukrainian infantry were in danger of being overrun, the Ukrainian tank brigade sent this tank out to strike the building. It was too big for FPV drones to hit it. They would say need 150 FPV drones, say, to try and take out that building. So they sent a tank in to direct fire into it. The tank used basically half its ammunition on exterminating that Russian platoon and really damaging the building, making it difficult for them to use. And unfortunately, as the tank was withdrawing, the fog started to lift, and the tank also collided with a tree, and the tree branch ripped this kind of netting that they put on to protect the tanks from FPV drones, just as some kind of barrier to stop them detonating on the armor. And that left the tank vulnerable. And as the tank was pulling back, a Russian FPV drone hit it and killing all three of the crew members inside that T-64 tank. And that had really upset the Ukrainian tank company that I visited with. But I think it illustrates the nature of this war. You have these kind of Soviet era vehicles which still have a purpose and are still called on to do specific assignments, but they're having to try and adapt them. And this tank company was very busy welding grills and putting nets on these tanks to try and protect them from these FPV drones, which are really all over the battlefield now.
It's really interesting how the use of tanks has changed as well during this war. And you were saying that you were told that the actual instance of a tank duel it just doesn't happen anymore on the battlefield in Ukraine.
So yeah, it was quite a commonplace occurrence in the first year of the war, and it increasingly became less and less. And the tanks are used very sparingly now because of this vulnerability to FPV drones. The drones are much better at targeting the weak spots of the armor, and the pilots flying them are now very experienced in hitting the weak spots in the armor of these tanks. And especially with these Soviet era tanks, the Russians have them as well, and they know exactly where they're vulnerable. With some of the Western provide tanks like the Challenger, they have actually thicker armor, better reactive armor, and it's more difficult for the Russians to pinpoint where is a weak point in that armor. And the only way that they've been destroyed is with very large Lancet FPV drones. So yeah, it's a very interesting. There is still a use for the tanks on the battlefield, but they're dug in most of the time. They're hidden almost all the time, and they're used very sparingly if Ukrainian position infantry are about to be overrun. They can't afford to just have them out in the open all the time as an intimidating tactic.
Really tragic situation with the loss of those 3 lives. And you say that they're used sparingly when Ukrainian forces are about to be overrun. That was exactly the situation, wasn't it, in north of Toretsk, the images we saw, but they were successful in their mission.
They were successful. They destroyed that most of that building. They estimated to have killed around 10 Russian troops there. Couldn't tell exactly because of the damage in the building. But the Russians stopped their advance. They didn't continue pushing after that, and the Ukrainian infantry were able to clear their lines at that point. So they obviously still have a use. These tanks, they still can be very effective, and again, especially against infantry, when infantry see a tank like that coming close to you, it's very intimidating, and it will force most soldiers to withdraw.
Mm. You talked about the effect that it had on the other soldiers. What kind of toll is the war taking on the people you met who can't be rotated out for lack of replacements?
Right. They were talking about how Ukraine has tried to implement this new recruitment strategy to attract people 18 to 24 years old to join voluntarily. A new 1 million hryvnia payment, which is equivalent to about £20,000, if you join up and if you serve your contract. But that hasn't had much success. The brigade, which is several thousand men, had only had about a couple of dozen replacements as a result of this. And that means that these tank crews are basically living, eating, sleeping by their vehicles. They can't afford to have a break away from them. They're always on call, and they're exhausted. And you could see some of the men that I talked to had repeat concussions, when their tanks had been hit. And sometimes, the conversations were pretty interrupted by clear memory loss and the hands shaking and the twitching eyes, and you can see like the real signs of repeat concussions.
Is this the first time you met these people, or have you seen them before?
It's the first time that I'd met this tank company, yes.
And how do they compare to the other soldiers you've met on the front line? I mean, you talking about the twitching hands and the kind of toll it's taken on them? Do they seem in a worse condition, or is this fairly representative?
I think it depends on the kind of battlefield that they're fighting in, and these, the group that I met with, the guy who was worst affected, he'd been concussed several times. Some of these soldiers also, they had been fighting since as early as 2016. When the Russians had their hybrid invasion of Donbass. So some of these professional career soldiers that have been hit time and time again over a long period of time. So they're experienced tank crews, but also the exhaustion of having to live by their vehicles and adapt to this new warfare is obviously beginning to show its toll. It was quite a contrast, I'd say, with the Challenger 2 tank crews that I met outside the Kursk region, who were kind of very enthusiastic about their view. They seemed in better health. They seemed to be better taken care of. And when they'd been hit by Russian drones or Russian artillery, the vehicles had protected them a lot better than the Soviet vehicles, and some of the technology in these British tanks prevent the soldiers inside being concussed in the same way as if a Ukrainian tank is hit.
Because this was a T-64, wasn't it, that you saw them operating?
It was an old T-64, yeah.
Mm. Oh, and what impact is this all having on their personal relationships, both with those on the front line, but also back home?
Well, I think it's really taking a toll. It's 3 years already. These people are on the front lines with very, very little rest. An average soldier will have a month away if they're not injured, to spend with loved ones. So it's a month a year away from the front lines, and meanwhile their families are worrying about them constantly. And it's pretty much impossible to have a kind of meaning relationship with a spouse, for example. And one of the commanders we met said that he, through the course of the war, had got divorced from his wife, and he understood her why she was frustrated. She felt like she didn't have the same husband that she had before the war, and that she also didn't get to see him at all, and that he wasn't really helping with the kids. She decided that it was safer for them to move abroad. So even in this month that he has off, he wasn't able to spend time with them, and ultimately that was the end of their marriage.
And also in terms of comrades, I mean, you write about the fact that because of the high casualty rate, people are afraid to make strong relationships.
Right. So the same commander was saying, at the beginning of this full scale invasion, it was really, really hard because I was losing people that I had been fighting with. He was another career tankist. He'd been fighting with people for 6 years. And he said he'd lost a lot of those crews, and that he'd taken those losses very personally, and they'd really upset him. And so now when the new crews come through and he's not expecting them to survive that long, he's much more guarded in how he approaches the relationships with him. And he doesn't invest himself that much in getting to know them because he's worried about the impact that it will have on him if they get killed.
It's really interesting to know what effect someone like you going and talking to these soldiers actually has. Do they feel some kind of, I don't know, support from the fact that a journalist is showing an interest and can speak their language and talk to them about what's going on, and perhaps give a bit of a breath, as they're not getting away from the front line or having any time off, actually get a bit of breath of fresh air from the outside?
Yeah, I think it's really important for them. They always are very appreciative to meet foreign journalists. They're really appreciative to meet British journalists. I think all the Ukrainian soldiers recognize the support, the moral support, at least, that the UK has given to Ukraine, and they're really, really appreciative of that. Especially now with America wavering on support, continuing support, they see UK as the kind of the main backer, the main ally, and they're very happy to speak to us. It's always difficult, some people are reluctant to take us somewhere that they consider very dangerous because they're worried about the consequences of it. But I think they all really need the recognition that we give them, just that they can show the work that they've done, the effectiveness that they've done, and pay tribute to some of their fallen colleagues, like the three men who were killed in that tank.
And Maxim, you talked a bit earlier about the high number of deaths of the Russian forces. What did you learn about the way that they are being treated by their commanders in the Toretsk area?
So there have been some radio intercepts which suggest that the Russians are being exhorted to go forward, and if they withdraw, they'll be shot by their commanders. We were played radio intercepts where it appeared to be the Russians telling their troops they had to go forward. If they came back, they would be shot. Russians not paying attention severe wounds that their soldiers might be carrying, and if they treat them and then send them back before they fully recovered. And there are clips on that, you can watch these on the internet as well, that we were shown of Russian troops, with crutches, being put onto motorbikes or quad bikes and sent forward to try and take positions when they're barely able to walk.
You also write about these kind of incremental advances that they make using a kind of camouflage midi tents. What's going on there?
Yeah, some of these are things it shows the desperation to try and hide from these eyes in the sky. And people are trying to find all different ways to kind of homemade devices to try and avoid detection. And in one incident, it appeared almost comical, as a guy who had a big kind of robe over him that was designed to hide his outline and also deflect heat, so that he wouldn't give off a thermal signature when he was moving. And he was just lifting this robe and moving meter by meter and then putting it down, in the hope that if he moved slowly, he wouldn't be noticed. But ultimately, Ukrainians did notice them.
Was that a one-off?
I've heard about it before. I mean, people are trying to use all kinds of techniques to avoid detection. There are definitely thermal deflective kits that are being issued. The Ukrainians use them as well, capes and things like that. I mean, not necessarily a static one. They're trying to use things a bit more modern. I think the tactic of moving only a meter and then putting it down and then another meter is kind of absurd. It doesn't really work. But certainly there are devices that soldiers are using. Firstly, they have beginning to have personal electronic warfare devices so that they can jam these drones, put them on backpacks. And then again, there's also these very important reflective robes which will stop it, especially at night, a thermal imaging drone being able to see you.
And Maxim, you said the Ukrainians noticed this person. Was he killed?
He was killed.
Yeah. The Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Christopher Cavalli, recently told the Senate Armed Forces Committee that over the last 3 years, the effectiveness of the Russian ground forces has deteriorated, whereas the Ukrainian forces has improved. How has that changed and the way they fight on the front line?
I think, yeah, we've seen that Ukrainians adapt to technology faster than the Russians. The problem is that the Russians then catch up and they're able to use these kind of technologies at scale. They seem to be better at scaling up their industrial effort, especially because they haven't been under the same kind of pressure of nightly strikes that the Ukrainians are under from Russian Russian jets and missiles. Ukraine has been incredibly effective given what it started with. The manpower issue is a really serious one, and I think it's not one to gloss over. But I think Cavoli was trying to make the point to Americans that you have this global rival, very aggressive global rival, and investing in Ukraine's defense is an investment in Europe and possibly the US's defense, and it's the best, most cost-effective way that you have to erode Russian armed forces. The Ukrainians, for a fraction of the cost of the American defense budget, have eviscerated the enormous Russian war machine, and that is something that I think many Americans might consider a good use of taxpayers' money.
And he also pointed out something that you mentioned, alluded to earlier, the fact that where Russian forces are trying to break the front lines, they've gone from company-sized attacks to platoon and now even smaller. You talked about that a little bit earlier as well, about the small numbers making the small advances. Do you think that's sustainable?
Well, it's more sustainable in terms of manpower, but it's obviously not going to get you a strategic breakthrough. I mean, it's a policy of attrition where you just wear down the enemy and you will take hundreds of meters, maybe kilometers at a time. But it doesn't really give you the manpower to create a breakthrough that you can then exploit with armored vehicles. And we see actually again there was a very large Russian column moving towards the front lines, which was destroyed by the Ukrainians just the other week, because that is ultimately the way that you need to penetrate and break through lines and cause a kind of a collapse in and get in behind Ukrainian defenses. Now, one of the problems that the Russians face is that this war has been going on for so long, and the Ukrainians are very well dug in and fortified in all of these areas, and they're expecting attacks regularly. So this small groups tactic, it can get you some advances, but it's never going to get you what you want, all of the Donbass or all of Kherson or all of Zaporizhia region.
I was just going to ask you how much of Donetsk Oblast is under Russian occupation at the moment, and have the peace negotiations made any difference to the intensity of fighting for it?
Well, the only thing that peace negotiations seem to be doing is accelerating the conflict and the level of intensity, as the Russians maybe are trying to take as much territory as they can before any peace negotiation. And they're also aware that this is a window where the Ukrainians are not counting on supplies from the US. So even if they have enough for the time being, the Ukrainians still have to ration their supplies. But if they knew that they were going to get a new shipment of weapons from the Trump administration, they could fight much more effectively. They could use a lot more of their arsenal against the Russians to stop the Russians. So it's just encouraging the Russians to attack harder and further.
Maxim, it's been really good talking to you. Look forward to seeing your article. It'll be coming out in the coming days, I understand. I'd better let you get back to work, but thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.